we're here with Samuel Gregg, who is the Director of Research at the Acton Institute, based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're very excited to have you here in Guatemala.
It's wonderful to be back.
Sam Gregg has written extensively on political economy, economic history, ethics and finance, and natural law theory. And he is the author of The Commercial Society, Becoming Europe, For God and Profit, among other books. So basically today we wanted to ask you about Venezuela, the situation, the political situation in Venezuela, which is of great concern to Guatemalans.
It's a great concern, I think, to anyone who takes liberty in the free society seriously. I mean, the situation in Venezuela, every time you think it couldn't get worse, it manages to get worse. I do think that the step of the National Assembly of Venezuela to declare someone as an interim president, in other words, to essentially describe the Maduro regime as illegitimate, is very important, and maybe even more important is the fact that so many countries around the world have basically adopted the same position, that the regime is fundamentally illegitimate, and the only thing to dialogue now about is the conditions under which it leaves office. So that's a positive thing, I think, because I think for many people, the whole issue of Venezuela was something that they knew about, but they weren't paying too much attention to. But this latest step, I think, has really raised the stakes and made people really aware of just what is happening there as a consequence of this leftist populist regime, which has been in power now for almost 20 years. I think people forget that. So that's a good thing. The bad thing, I think, of course, is the economic situation is getting worse, that the regime apparently has not lost the will to use its security forces to maintain its position in power. And that's important because I think we often talk about human beings' inalienable desire for liberty, which is true and good, but we shouldn't forget that regimes that are authoritarian or tyrannical can stay in power for a very, very long time if they possess the will to do so and the loyalty of the security apparatus. And I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing the regime as signaling that it has no intention of leaving. The real question now, I think, is how long it can maintain the loyalty of the leadership of the military and the security forces. And that's an open question right now.
I saw a statement that made an impact on me, that this is not just a case of a failed state, but failure of socialism. I think
Yes.
that lesson has not been stated enough.
I think that's true. In fact, what you see in, for example, much of North America and Western Europe, you hear people saying things like, well, yes, this is terrible, but it's not real socialism. This is not what we mean by socialism. There are even some people in the United States who are still defending the regime on the basis that it's somehow promoting greater equality, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I guess it is promoting greater equality in the sense that everyone is getting equally poor and equally miserable. So I think the fact that Venezuela proves once again, as if we needed another history lesson, that socialism doesn't work and that it brings immense poverty and destruction of human liberty in its wake, inevitably, I think in some respects Venezuela is reminding us of that. The other thing, however, I think, which is very important, is that people are calling it for what it is as well. I've been very impressed, for example, by the position taken by the Venezuelan Catholic Bishops' Conference. They haven't just been saying things like, well, there's a need for dialogue, the opposition and the regime need to work something out. They've also been saying that the root of the problem is totalitarianism, Marxism, and socialism, and that really the only dialogue that's left is the terms of the regime's departure. So within Venezuela, there's at least one institution that's willing to talk about the problem in this very direct and explicit way that I think, for example, other Catholics throughout the world, other Christians throughout the world who might be somehow attracted to socialism or think that this is the right way in which society should develop, I think that this is an example where you have Christian leaders saying, no, this is what socialism leads to. And it's not just the economic problems associated with it, it's the gross debasement of human dignity, which is also as worse as the economic problems.
And for those who insist on dialogue, what what arguments can be used now to say, I agree with the bishops of Venezuela that it's past the point of dialogue, but what arguments can we employ to persuade people that you cannot dialogue with a totalitarian regime that's willing to burn humanitarian aid and kill its own people?
Well, I think a good thing we should be pointing out is that totalitarian regimes, when they are cornered, they become like a wild animal, and they will strike out at anything they perceive to represent a threat, whether it's the church, which is basically the only institution in Venezuela that now has any credibility whatsoever, or whether it's people protesting in the streets, whether it's people trying to bring in aid from the outside. I think this pointing out that the sheer amount of violence that is now being employed by the regime really means that this is a regime that has no intention of giving up power, has no intention of sharing power, that has no incentive to share power or to even cede control, because if it did, what would happen? Well, presumably there would be some sort of public accounting that would be needed to be held of those responsible for this situation. So regime officials have there's nothing that they can say that gives them a reason to enter into dialogue or to even, let alone give up power, because at some point they know they will be held responsible for their actions, and that is enough reason for them to try and continue clinging to power.
To hold on, okay. Changing the subject. There's a debate going on, I think, in the United States and in other places here also in Guatemala about libertarian Catholicism or libertarian Christianism, and can libertarians be religious, and can people who are religious espouse free market views?
Sure.
So it goes both ways. So how compatible are these two currents?
Well, I think with many of these discussions, a lot depends what you mean by the free society, the free market, the society that takes liberty seriously or even values liberty as the most important value, and what type of religion that we're talking about. So obviously a type of free market position that is virulently atheistic, then that's going to be a problem for a Christian. But if you look, I think, at the foundations of the free society, if you look at the way that it has developed throughout history, it's simply undeniable that these societies first emerged in a world that was profoundly Christian. And that's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence because Christianity takes freedom very, very seriously. Christianity takes reason very seriously. It's in the context of the early modern and medieval Christian world in which we saw institutions like constitutionally limited government. The first market economies really developed in medieval Europe. Concepts of rule of law are first fleshed out in detail by medieval and early modern Catholic and Protestant theologians. All these roots are distinctly marked by a particular type of culture, and it's very difficult to take a free society away from that culture, away from those roots, without something starting to happen that may raise questions about what type of free society do we want to live in. Because there's more than one free society. There's a free society that's characterized by, say, for example, relativism, by materialism, even by subtle forms of collectivism, for example. And then there are free societies that are based upon a vision of the human person as made in the image of God, a society that views human rights as fundamentally grounded upon a certain vision of the nature of the human person, a certain type of free society that sees constitutional order as not just efficient, but also as reflecting the fact that human beings are sinful and weak, and we need to limit government power by instituting checks and balances. So when we talk about this relationship between the free society and religion, or the free society and Christianity, we have to ask ourselves some basic definitional questions first. What do we mean by a free society? What type of religion are we talking about? We also need to talk about the roots and origins of these societies and whether they can seriously be sustained once those roots start to disappear. A good example, I think, is what we find in Western Europe today, where you see the fading of Christianity from the public square. And what do you have? Well, are we freer? Are those societies freer? I would say no. If anything, they're moving in a more decisively social democratic direction. Are these more ethical societies? I would say no. They're moving much more in the direction of raw utilitarianism and, frankly, ethical relativism. Are these societies in which people are freer? I would say no. Try, if you're a citizen in, say, I don't know, contemporary Britain today, try getting up in public and saying that you think that gender theory is fundamentally flawed and see what happens to you. In other words, what we're seeing happen in many societies which detach themselves from these Christian roots, there's a vacuum, and the vacuum gets filled. And the vacuum usually gets filled with very bad ideas, either bad religion or particular ideologies that are highly materialistic, highly utilitarian, and cannot provide a sound account of the nature of the human person and human dignity. So I think in the end, if Christians are unable to work out their relationship with a free society, or those people who are, let's call them non-believers, but who do believe in a free society, are unable to work out the right relationship with the religion from which this society comes from, if there isn't some sort of constructive engagement, then I think you'll see a splintering going on. And I don't think that's healthy either for Christianity or for the free society.
I saw an article saying that never have Catholic writings been inclined to endorse a liberal view of a society, and that, in fact, Catholic liberals have been on the fringes of Catholicism. And I thought of Lord Acton and Dollinger, his teacher, and how really their quest for a free, for freedom within a Catholic framework was very much on the fringes. And so is it the case that there has been a misunderstanding maybe on the part of the Catholic hierarchy as to what we mean by freedom? Or is there a tendency to conflagrate freedom with individualism
with license
and I don't know, laissez-faire?
Well, sure. Society. What you see is a waning back and forth. So if you go to the case of, say, medieval Europe is actually a pretty free society. It's a society in which, as I said before, you see the emergence of constitutional government. You see the idea of human rights being developed by canon lawyers. You also see the emergence of trade, really the first forms of capitalism. And at the time, most of the leadership of the Christian world did not really have a problem with this. You move to the age of the early modern period, and you see the rise of absolutism, and you see absolutist Catholic monarchs, you see absolutist Protestant monarchs using religion to exert more control over society. Then you move into, say, the 18th century, the 19th century, and you see people in the name of liberty trying to destroy the Christian church. That's what you see with much of the French Revolution. You see this throughout the 19th century, and this is what I think people like Acton and Tocqueville are trying to deal with, because they recognize that this is a deeply unhealthy situation, not just for those who favor liberty, it's also a deeply unhealthy situation for those who favor Christian belief and Christian practice. When you move to the 20th century, again, you see this ambiguity in the relationship And it changes at different points. You see examples like, for example, Franco's Spain, where religion is used almost as an ideology to support the regime. Then you also had the Second Vatican Council, and a very beautiful statement on the part of the Council when it comes to understanding the nature of religious liberty and what that actually means. I think if you look in the late 20th century, you see a very constructive dialogue going on between Christian leaders on the one hand and advocates of the free society. I'm thinking people like Pope John Paul II, but also leading evangelical thinkers such as Chuck Colson in the United States, who want to bridge the gap between freedom on the one hand and Christianity on the other. And I think the message that they try to bring is, yes, we take freedom very seriously too, but we also think that freedom is linked to revelation, and if you're not a believer, it's certainly linked to natural law and right reason, which tells us what the proper use of our freedom is. And I think at the moment what we're seeing is a disassociation of freedom from the claims of natural law and the claims of right reason, things that both Catholic and Protestant thinkers have taken very, very seriously when they've talked about the nature of freedom. So if anything, I think those of us who believe in the free society and who are believers, we need to be reaching out much more to those people who believe in the free society, but who are uncertain or even doubtful or maybe even hostile to the place of faith in that, and to try and engage in a conversation about how one reconciles the human quest for freedom and for liberty in society is characterized by that, with the claims of a faith that purports to take freedom very seriously, which also purports to take reason very seriously.
I think that the reason aspect is one of the key arguments against religious libertarians. I don't like to use the word libertarians, but classical liberals, because they think that religion is a
against
cluster
reason
of dogmas that do not, that they have no scientific basis, and then you cannot possibly believe in reason and be religious at the same time.
Well, there are so many responses to that. One is to point out that when Christianity first emerged in the ancient world, one of the things that characterized it was the attachment that Christians placed upon reason. And they would use reason to point out that, look, these pagan myths, they're literally ridiculous. They literally make no sense. They don't reflect our conception of the order in the world that we find. The second thing they also did was to make it very clear that the Christian God is not just pure will. The Christian God is not a being that treats human beings like playthings that it just messes around with. The beginning of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word. And the word in Greek, and it's used in Greek in the Gospel of John, is logos. God is not unreasonable. God is in fact divine reason. So my point is that Christianity and Judaism, I would say, take reason very, very seriously. It's seen as the other way in which we can understand religious realities, scientific realities, empirical realities, philosophical realities. But this question about reason is very important, because I think one of the problems we have in much of the West right now is that we have reduced reason to the natural sciences. We've reduced reason to empirical inquiry. Now, natural sciences are very important. The empirical method of inquiry has been very liberating. I'm very glad we have it, because I'm very glad we have dental care and that we're not all dead at the age of 40. But the problem is that empirical reason can only discern things that are measurable, that are physical. It can't discern things that fall outside that realm. And in fact, the empirical sciences themselves, their very coherence depends upon non-empirical claims, like the principle of non-contradiction. X and Y are different. They cannot be the same. Or 2 times 2 equals 4. 2 by 2 can never equal 5. even the very wanting to know the truth about the world is, of course, something that drives the natural sciences. But that drive comes from somewhere else. It doesn't arise from the empirical sciences in themselves. In other words, there are other forms of reason. Let's call it natural reason. We can even call it natural theology. We can even call these things as reflecting the notion that there is a divine creator. All these things, I think, make the scientific project possible. It's not a coincidence that the birth of the modern sciences does not happen in the 19th century, the 17th century, even the 20th century. It begins really in the 12th and the 13th century with people like Albertus Magnus, who was Thomas Aquinas' teacher, who said that there are empirical ways of understanding the world. We should be using what we know about the world empirically. And why do we want to know this? Because we're interested in truth. The same truth that drives us in the direction of wanting to know the truth about God is the same drive that causes us to set up universities in the first place and to engage in the natural sciences in the first place at all. Why would we do these things if we didn't think that they came from a bigger truth and lead to illumination of truth?
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For this interview, and I hope you have a very good visit in Guatemala.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here again at Francisco Marroquín, and thank you to Fe Libertad for hosting me.